My name is Janet Stolfi Alfano, and I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you all to the book discussion of Broke in America, Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty, with the authors Joanne Goldblum and Colleen Shaddox. I am honored to know them both as friends and colleagues, and I'm sure that you all have taken the time to read their bios, so I'm going to keep this personal. I first met Joanne in 2007 on a job interview for operations manager for what was then known as the New Haven Diaper Bank. And after speaking with her for about 20 minutes, I knew that I wanted to work for her and I didn't care how much it paid. It is incredible to see all that she has accomplished over the past 17 years and more, founding the New Haven Diaper Bank and the National Diaper Bank Network, all her advocacy work, and of course, this book. And there is so much I could say about Joanne and her fierce advocacy and determination and her ability to bring people together on an issue and so many issues. And one of those amazing people is Colleen Shaddox, a journalist, advocate, writer, and truth teller. I came to know Colleen from her work capturing the stories of the families served by the Diaper Bank with clarity, dignity, and respect. And she continues to share her talents in her role at the National Diaper Bank Network, and of course on this book as well. Tonight's discussion is being moderated by Kia Levy-Burden, the principal and founder of Launch Consulting, LLC. She's a deep thinker, listener, and communicator. She's a principled, thoughtful facilitator and creative, and consistently connects the thought, word, and deed. And I will leave you with my favorite quote that she wrote in her own bio. She believes in what is possible and not just what already is. You are all really in for a treat. And I, for one, am looking forward to a lively and thoughtful conversation, and one that we all create together. Now I'll hand it off to Kia.
Thank you, Janet, for such a lovely introduction. And yeah, I'm looking forward to a conversation that we're going to all create together as well. I cannot be more excited to be in this conversation with Colleen and Joanne, and will not bore all of our guests about how I know you all and how I'm excited to be working with you all. But really, I have some questions and I have some thoughts, but I really want to be in conversation like, we're at book club and we're talking about one of our favorite books, which is Broke in America. So let's have a little bit of a book club conversation this evening. One of the things that I wanted to start with is I have discovered Audible during the pandemic, whereas I would love to find time to sit down and read a book. For whatever reason, now having all the time in the world, I can't find time to sit down and actually read. So I've been actually listening and reading this book at the same time. And it's such an interesting duality to live in. As I was listening to some of the Audible and the narrator was saying Broke in America, for some reason I kept hearing Broken America. And it hit me, and I was wondering, does that resonate with you all? Are there elements of a broken America that really influenced or resonated in some of what you wrote in this book?
Colleen, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we did that on purpose. We liked that kind of double meaning. The original title of the book was really Broke, just plain old broke, which we meant as a description of the folks we were talking to and also of our system. If there is one point we make in the book, it's that the problem isn't people. People are just wonderful. People have all kinds of strengths. The problem is a system that makes it extremely likely that a whole bunch of us are going to live in poverty. And that's really the thing we're trying to change with the book.
Go ahead, Joanne. To add to that, I was just going to say that, I think the reason that it's so important to think of it as broken not just broke, is that it can be fixed, right?
Yeah.
So this book, we both wanted to talk about the fact that things are broken, but that in fact, like anything, like if you break something, often you can fix it. And so our goal was both to focus on what was wrong, but also to talk about what we could do.
And I appreciate that, because we can't think about, if we're not willing to look at the pieces of something that is broken, if we're not willing to really acknowledge the brokenness of a thing, then it can't be fixed until we first acknowledge that it's broken. And that's how I really hold this book. I hold this book as an invitation for awareness and accountability, both for myself and for others, particularly in this moment that we find ourselves in as a nation. It's almost like this is part of a required reading, as people are finding themselves in books like How to Be Anti-Racist or Caste or White Fragility. It Broke in America is in this required reading, learning for how we can be, right? For what's possible for us as a country. I guess my question is, how do you want people to engage with this book?
Like, I hope that there are dog-eared copies of this all over the place with coffee stains and Post-it notes throughout it. We really meant it to be a guide for action. We want to change thought, but every chapter has things you can do at the end of it. And you can do that on the level of, trying to change national policy, or you can do things on the level of trying to change policy in your school, in your neighborhood. And we absolutely believe that that's possible. And it's not something you need to wait for somebody else to do. It's funny. I think we're all part of community leadership. And I have like this really strange relationship with leadership. I think deep down, I'm an anarchist. I just believe we can all be leaders. We can all get up and do the thing. And that's what I want people to do when they read the book. I want them to get up and do the thing. Joanne's a great getter-upper and doer of things.
Yeah, and I think, we also really hope that people talk about the things that we bring up in the book. So there are lots of action items, but beyond that, I think that we wanted to create conversations about things that many people don't talk about. Or people might say, well, that's not, what we talk about over dinner. These are hard conversations, and we wanted to try to give language to how to have these conversations.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of these hard conversations. So in your book, you write, in order to truly understand poverty in the US, it is critical to understand how it reinforces how it is reinforced and how it reinforces other forms of oppression. And to have this conversation be intersectional, right? And you all do an amazing job of telling the story of how poverty intersects with trauma, with stress, with education, with the child welfare system, with racism, and the list goes on. And these are conversations, like, if we're being honest, that if we have the choice, we'd rather not have, right? We'd rather talk about our favorite Netflix show, or, all the places that we can't go anymore right now. But the people who are actually living in the intersection of these issues don't have that choice to not talk about them. And so I want to know, what are some of the hard conversations that you have walked into, or you've invited other people into, through what you have written about in your book?
I think the most shocking to me was in the water chapter.
Mhm.
We really saw how this was a particular deprivation forced on people of color. I talked to a woman who lived in a neighborhood in Detroit that was full of shutoffs. And she said to me, this is gentrification. They're trying to push us out. And she went on to explain that the neighborhood school had closed, the neighborhood parks had closed, the neighborhood library had closed. I mean, it was hard to argue with that, you know. There was another place in Alaska where the federal government had actually relocated a bunch of Native Alaskans in the 19th century that never had water and that was literally being destroyed by climate change. That was clearly racism. You know, Congress can't even get to the point of doing a study bill on reparations. And that's just wrong. I know it's controversial. I know people find it hard to take, but we saw the echoes of racist policy of the past and racist policy of the present really sticking people in poverty. And we can't not talk about reparations.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that we really saw as some place where there's intersectionality that people are talking about more now is voter suppression. And, I think the fact that it is so widely accepted in the United States that people who have committed certain crimes are not able to vote. And it's only in the last few years that there's been real movement on that. I mean, we have a society that basically says, even after you've paid your debt, so that's the idea of prison, right? Is that you're paying your debt to society, that debt is never paid off. And that's true both with voting and then also with, some of the federal entitlements that exist for people in poverty, temporary assistance for needy families, SNAP benefits, what used to be called food stamps. There are lifetime bans on certain people who have been convicted of drug felonies, which it's a racist dog whistle, right? I mean, murderers are not given a lifetime ban on receiving SNAP benefits. Rapists, no problem. Drug felonies. Now, what is that? I think that, we sort of say that, but I think when you take a step back and really look at it, that is a way to keep Black and brown people from having the same access.
So go ahead, Colleen. Yeah.
One more thing that we didn't really address in the book, like it's almost another book. We kept hearing about marriage.
Yes.
That marriage was the solution, which like
to poverty?
About poverty. Yeah. That, well, like you need a penis in the house if you want to be poor, right? I can't control how people arrange their families, and I don't want to. Right. And if you think that the main problem that's causing poverty in this country is single mothers, then I think you ought to worry about women's pay equity.
Yeah.
Childcare,
Well, I think that's fascinating because don't most women get penalized if they have a partner in their home, particularly around housing subsidies or around food stamps?
Well, and you know what, Kia, that's fascinating, right? Because wealthy women are, you get more, right? So when there are two earners in a house, when you file your income taxes jointly, there are savings. But when you're receiving benefits from the government, it takes things away. That's a really, I think, interesting and important point, Kia.
There were a lot of places where we saw that things that middle and upper class women are rewarded for, women in poverty are punished for. Right. Like, oh, isn't it great? You're taking a year off to stay with your kids. but that's not the feeling with mothers in poverty. Even if the daycare is going to cost more than she makes at her minimum wage job, we expect her to be out there working. It's bizarre and it's cruel.
Yeah, I want to stay in this. The thought that was coming to me, Colleen, was this idea of like reward and punishment. And, I know that we are talking about your book, but since you said that you want the book to really evoke conversation, let's stay in the hard conversation, please. And, why is it that we are okay as a nation to really punish poor people for being poor, to make it harder for them to navigate life simply because they don't have enough money or have enough access to resources where they could make the money? Why is it? And I know you don't know the answer, but like, let's have a conversation about this idea of really punishing poor people for being poor.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's really, I mean, it's one of the main points of our book is that people are not the problem, but as a society, we like to say it is an individual's fault for not having what they need, and that for people of wealth, that somehow they have accomplished something and they deserve to have that comfort, regardless of where that money came from.
Right.
Regardless, and I think that it's easier for us as a capitalist society to say that individuals who have not managed to take advantage of capitalism are somehow, less than.
There's, the book of Job. Job has a really bad time of it. Job's a good guy. He has a really bad time of it. But Job's friends keep coming around and saying, "What did you do to offend God? Apologize to God right now." Like, this is a lot of the book of Job is speaking up with this. And I think that shows the human tendency to want to separate yourself from the person who's having misfortune because you want it to be their fault, because then it can't happen to you.
Yeah.
And so there's this tremendous stigmatization of people in poverty. And it is very intersectional. The stereotypes about people in poverty are racist stereotypes. They are sexist stereotypes. We spend a lot of time in the book talking about how many white Americans are poor, to try and move that image that is in the media that all poor people in America are people of color. And this is one reason why we believe Americans are okay with letting poverty continue, because it's somebody else, because we other people in poverty.
Yeah. Let's talk about representation for a minute. And you talk a little bit about the book about the narrative that media and film and news will portray about poverty. And to your point, Colleen, it is about making this separation. Oh my gosh, right? Like I could never be like them, or I could never, thank God I'm not like them. And whether it's a person of color or a person for whom English isn't their first language, and this idea of representation, we question, like as a society, there are things that we question all the time, right? We are looking for the way for something to not be the truth. And then there are things that we don't question at all, that we are comfortable with, because it affirms our narrative of ourselves, and it affirms that we have a little bit of something over somebody else. And for me, when you talk about intersectionality of race and sexism, to me, you can't not have that conversation without talking about power and privilege. Even if I have 10 cents and you have 5, that's 5 more cents than you do. And so there's enough of a separation there. And I get to at least identify as something other than the person having 5 cents. that to me, as a Black woman in America, feels so embedded in in the way I experience life, even as a college educated, business owner. I still experience life like that. The idea of like, well, she's good, but we're still a little bit better. And so how do we begin to wrestle with that narrative and challenge it in the spirit of like having the difficult conversation?
It's a really good, I mean, it's a good question. It's a hard question, Kia,
Yeah,
right? I think part of the way we have to do it, um, you know, certainly as we were writing this book and as we spoke to people about this book, people said, you are two white women from Connecticut writing this book, right? Um, Honestly, I think that is part of what has to happen. White people need to recognize that even if they did not set out to, or even if they have not personally created the situation, that there is a level of privilege and that we have to find ways to make those changes, which is why, I keep coming back to the fact that we have solutions in the book. It's why we feel being active is so important, because when you're passive, when you don't recognize that you have a role in it,
yeah,
it just keeps happening. And so you have to step out of your comfort zone and allow um, allow yourself to be open to losing some of that power.
yeah.
I think another really important thing is changing who has access to the media.
Mhm.
Mm,
So we were determined to talk to lots of people all over the country to not make poverty, the problem of this family or this place or whatever. And it's hard to get people in poverty to talk to, right?
yeah,
They don't have websites, they don't have publicists, and they're often hesitant. There's nothing in it for them. It is a
yeah,
big ethical rule in journalism that you never pay a source. But I think that with the people journalists typically covered, there is payment. They're promoting their new album, they're running for office, they have something to be gained by talking to the journalist. And the folks we talked to had nothing to be gained.
yeah,
I was talking with one woman and she told me she needed help with her medication. She just couldn't afford her medication. So I gave her money, which was a
yeah,
major ethical ding. And I'm sorry that I didn't start doing it years earlier. I think we need to recognize that when oppressed people speak up and share their painful stories, that is work and that needs to be compensated. And I
yeah,
think we need to have a big discussion within journalism about doing that, about making that what we do as a matter of course.
It's really interesting, and I hadn't thought about this before as being so connected, but in social work, right, we also have that same idea, is that
yep.
you can't give people things, that it
Boundaries,
creates boundaries, right?
right?
And in fact, when I first started the New Haven Diaper Bank all those years ago, while I was, doing community-based social work, that's what I was told, right? Is, I know that you see that the families you're working with need these things, but that's not your place. And in a certain way, I always tell the story. My kids were young when I first started the diaper bank, and all I could think about was, why do my children deserve more than the children that I'm working with?
Mm,
My kids don't deserve more food. That's just not, every child deserves food. Every child deserves a clean diaper. And and so I think it's really interesting. And I think that may be in part why Colleen and I are so so see
Perfectly
things
matched.
so much. Yes.
Yes. One of my favorite things, Joanne, that I've heard you say in telling of versions of this story is like, asking a supervisor, well, what's the intervention for toilet paper? Like what's the CBT model for how to get clean,
Mhm.
hygiene
Right. Right.
resources to a family?
Yeah, there is no clinical intervention
There's
for
right,
toilet paper.
right.
Just isn't.
And so sometimes it's just a matter of meeting that very basic need. When I started to engage with your book, one of the things that it brought back to my mind was a book I read in graduate school called Nickel and Dime. And
Mhm.
I can't remember the author of this book. And I have to be honest, I hated this book. I
Oh.
tore this book apart in the paper that I had to read because I was so offended that this white woman would go and pretend to be something that she wasn't and infiltrate the lives of these people and then try to tell their stories for them. Everything about that made me angry reading and analyzing that book. What I deeply appreciated about the way you all have written Broke in America is that you did not pretend to be anybody other than who you were and acknowledged all the things that you came with, and you let the people tell their stories. You did not tell their stories for them. You walked with them, and that made such a difference to me in reading a book talking about poverty and peoples whose voices are often not heard in the presentation of how you wrote this book. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. That was actually quite a hard thing to get by publishers. They suggested that the book should be more like nickel and dimed,
Yeah, well, I'm grateful that it wasn't. I'm
or
sorry.
more
Sorry
like
to
a
the
Well,
lady who wrote that
that's
book.
too big.
so- and you know what, Kia, one of the things that was equally as important was that we showed, um, first off, absolutely that they're not our stories. We would never, they weren't. But that also we wanted to show that it was a national problem, that
Yes.
it was from coast to coast, in the heartland, on the, in rural areas, in suburban areas, in urban areas, that this is not a problem specific to one person, one type of person, one area. You know, it's everywhere. And I
Yeah.
think that, early on you asked, what do we hope people get out of this? One of the things I hope people get is to recognize that they have friends and neighbors who are poor. Everybody has people in their community who are struggling. And a lot of us, because of the way that the United States is sort of the way because of segregation and the fact that segregation has continued for so long, both economic and racial, you often don't come in contact with people who are different than yourself.
Yeah. I actually want to pick up on what you just said, Joanne. And, something you wrote in the book was that the bad news of growing economic inequities, like they're not lessening, they're actually growing. And the deepening of poverty is a reality, but it's also an opportunity. So I want to talk about the opportunities that live in the reality of this really hard topic or intersection of topics that we've been talking about. How are you all offering this as an opportunity?
So, I mean, we've gotten a lot more interest in the book than we expected because of COVID.
Right.
Um, which of course we wrote the book, most of it before COVID, right? But more and more Americans are saying, gosh, I don't know how I'm going to diaper my baby. I don't
Yeah.
have certainty. And I hope that that creates some kind of empathy that people will appreciate that poverty is something that can happen to you when you're putting your head down and working as hard as you can.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, um, you know, it's yeah, it's just it's a very complicated and sort of um, Yeah, just actually, I'm sorry. I don't have anything to add to what Colleen said. It was great. I just started and then I realized there was no reason.
All right, don't worry
Oh,
about it.
no, there is something you want to add.
This is how we do in book club.
There's something I know you want to add, Joanne, that during COVID, our government gave
Oh,
people
yes.
money.
Right. That is what I
Right.
knew. That's what I was. Yes.
I
Thank
will
you.
give you money.
Tell us
That's
about the money.
solution.
Tell us about the money as a solution, as an opportunity.
So,
Well,
like, talk about the child tax credit. I'll be quiet.
no, it's you brought it. Go for it, Colleen.
So, policies that we are seeing now, like the children's allowance, that is predicted to lift like 40% of the kids who are in poverty now out of it. Rosa DeLauro's been working on that since like I was a raven-haired size 6.
18 years.
There you go.
How long has it been, Colleen?
Maybe I was a size 8 by then. But it never got anywhere when she was just talking about the people who are conventionally poor in this country. But now that poverty is reaching out and affecting more and more people who are formerly middle class, the government says, oh yeah, giving people money is a good solution when they don't have money. Right. We need to make things like that permanent.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about government funding, the governor's budget cut Janet's funding by 50%. And that is ridiculous. And everybody should call their state rep the second this call ends and tell them to put that money back.
So let's move into this conversation about advocacy and what we can do, like call our state reps to advocate for the diaper bank. I heard you say, Colleen, hoping that people will develop a level of empathy, right? Like knowing that it could be your neighbor. It's not that far away from you. And, we talked earlier about hoping that this book would generate like really hard conversations and really invite people to not avoid them anymore. Something I worry about in the idea of empathy and conversations is those can be really passive, right? Those can be really like at our leisure, and I, a lot of the work I do, particularly around racial equity work and talking about the lived experience of Black and Brown people in our country, and the hurt and the harm that we experience, and people listen to those conversations, and it's almost, there's this term that I've been hearing, I don't want to misuse it, but like trauma porn, right? So people can look at a hurtful or harmful situation and say, oh, that's so terrible. Or, oh my God, I can't believe those things are happening. But then that's the extent of it, right? That's where it stops. And they might have some empathy. They might give a donation. They might tell a neighbor about it. But it is this sort of at will engagement. And I'm so curious about moving us forward past this at will into really active, like the time is now, right? There's an urgency around what you're presenting to us in the book. And so what are the actual active things that people can begin to do to move it past the level of empathy and courageous conversation?
One thing, going back to diapers, we talk about the idea of, doing a diaper drive, doing a food drive, right? That's a great thing to do. But then we suggest you go a few steps further. Take a picture of yourself doing the diaper drive. And then a step further than that, send it to your elected officials, your state, local, and federal, and say, this is important to me. This is what I vote based on. Tell your elected officials the things that are important to you. And I think one thing that many of us don't realize is that what we think actually does impact our elected officials. They listen to us. And so, taking your activity and turning it into an opportunity for advocacy is always really important, so that it's not just charity, right? It's an active ability to change things. And then there's also always the issue of planning and zoning, right, Colleen?
Yes, those of us who live in Connecticut have great opportunities and great responsibilities to make change on the local level. There are two things that are going on in Connecticut structurally that perpetuate poverty and racism. One of them is exclusionary zoning, and the other is educational segregation, which is connected to it and connected to the whole way that we fund our schools in Connecticut. There are bills in the legislature right now that address both. And even more granularly than that, you can get involved on your own planning and zoning commission or your own board of education. It's not hard to do. They very often go begging for volunteers. And I mean, that's hard as a person who has some things to say about planning and zoning in my own community. You are, as opposed to just, putting a Black Lives Matter thing around your profile picture on Facebook, you're saying things publicly that the people you go to the grocery store don't want to hear. But that's the difference between just making yourself feel better and actually trying to make the world better. And we have to take those steps.
Yeah, and I think even if you don't have the wherewithal to join your planning and zoning board, go to the meetings. Being somebody who goes, voices your opinion, testify. You can go up to Hartford if you're in Connecticut, or to your state capital, wherever you are, and talk about the bills that are important to you. And I think that a lot of us think someone else will do it. There'll be plenty of people there. I don't need to go. And what we really hope is that people take that opportunity to say, you know what? My voice matters.
Yeah, to that point, Joanne, who's the people? Who is the who? Is it the people who are struggling under the oppression of poverty? Are the Black and brown people who are intersection between racism and the oppression of poverty? Is it people of means, of wealth, of access, of influence? Is it some partnership or some allyship around this? Who, when you say who or you say you, who's the who?
So, honestly, I think the who is everyone. I think that everybody's voice matters, and everybody has the opportunity to use their voice in different ways. So people of means may have more access, right? So you should use that access to talk about making change, and bring people with you, bring people perhaps who are impacted by oppression, people who are impacted by poverty. But I think that it is not one group, and I think that that's actually part of what's been the problem, is that there tend to be individual groups that talk about certain things. So you might see people impacted by something who come to testify about it. You don't see as many people who are not impacted coming to testify. And so I think it's really important to have both of those voices, or all of those voices. I think that it's really a matter of figuring out how your voice, whoever you are, can best be used.
And it's really important, if you are not someone directly affected by poverty, to first get the perspective of people who are before you go out and advocate, because your solution may not be the solution that works for them. It's very hard to imagine the myriad ways that poverty affects you if you don't live in it. Like, one of the things that we talk about in the book is, if you live in a community with a bad distribution of a shortage of affordable housing, which we all do because we live in Connecticut, get faith communities from the whole region to get together and come together and develop an affordable housing conference and conversation and make your legislators and town officials come. Like, the more that you can break down walls and act in concert, the more you can get done.
Absolutely.
I know that we are almost approaching our time where we're going to open it up for questions, but I have a question for each of you before we transition into that moment. Can you name a moment, a story, a reflection that you had in the making of this book that has forever changed you, that has had such an impact on you that you will never be the same because of that experience?
Yeah, Colleen mentioned that the water chapter was really eye-opening to us. There was a story in there, a woman that was interviewed they talked about a town in Alaska where they never had indoor plumbing, just didn't have it. And so the way that the community was structured, you collected your human waste in bags and then would have to carry those bags over to the area in the town where they kept them and then, dealt with that. One of the women described that she didn't allow her children to play outside in the spring during the thaw because there was human waste in the street. And, that's the United States. Yes, it's Alaska. It's the
Right.
United States.
It's the United States.
We are the wealthiest country in the world, or certainly among them. How could we possibly allow human waste to run in the street? That is a choice we make. And I think that actually, Kia, the thing that I can't get past, and I knew it before we started writing this, but it really crystallized it. These are all choices. These are absolutely all choices that we as a society have made and have accepted.
Yeah.
We say some people just don't have water. Who could say that? How can that be the answer? Well, if you don't pay your water bill, your water gets cut off.
Yeah.
I know I pay a water bill, right? I know that water isn't free. But it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that if you can't pay your water bill, you really don't get water.
Yeah. Any moments stand out for you, Colleen?
Yeah, mine came at the other end of the country, in Lytle, Texas, which was a very poor agricultural town near the Mexican border. And I interviewed two young men back to back who had somewhat similar stories. They were both tremendously good students who had done all sorts of extra stuff, working a lot, physics club, lettering and football. And they both got free rides to terrific universities, and neither of them could go. One young man, his dad was being audited by the IRS. His dad was a waiter with 8 children. There wasn't any money there for the IRS to get. It was a stupid technicality. And indeed, we know that the Trump administration targeted largely Hispanic border areas for audits. So that's why they got caught. So that held up his financial aid. He wasn't going to get it. So he was going into the military instead. And the other boy, he felt that he had a responsibility to his mother and his younger brother. And so he was going to just go to community college part-time and stay home and work. And the second kid was crying while I was talking to him, and like So the kind of work I do, I make people cry in interviews a lot. I'd never made a child cry before. And he was crying because he saw the hopelessness. He saw that he had done everything right. If anybody had ever pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, these two kids did. But the world just knocked him right back down. It gave a lie to this whole stay in school, study hard. Like it's more than that. We need to do more than that for these young men to give them a future. And it just made me so angry. I went back to my car and cried, because you're not supposed to cry in an interview. I do give people money now, but I still don't cry. And I thought, God, I wish I could win the lottery and send them both to college. But there'd be so many more kids like that still wouldn't go. We have to change everything. We can't leave bright, hardworking, wonderful kids in a hopeless situation.
Yeah.
And if I just wanted to add one thing to that, which is that another thing that I think we hope really comes from this book is that we recognize that things like this shouldn't be left to the kindness of strangers or to winning the lottery, right? That shouldn't be, GoFundMe shouldn't be the answer to medical debt. And having a kind person who's heard your story give you something cannot be our policy answer, you know, and that's really where we're left. And that's what has to change.
Yeah. We have to change everything. I thank you, Colleen. I mean, like there's not a better way to sort of shift in this conversation than to say, right, we have to change everything. You know, Broken America is not a book for us to read and get to the end of it and be like, oh, that was a good book. It's a call to action. There's a number of action items in that book, because the reality is, like, we have to change everything. So thank you both. This is definitely not enough time to be in this conversation. There's so much more to talk about and so much more to say. But I think that Abby is waiting on us to shift into this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Abby.
Oh gosh, that was like quite a transitional note. Thank you for sharing those stories, Joanne and Colleen. And those were great questions tonight, Kia. We do have a couple audience questions that I would like to get to. So one of our audience members tonight asks, are the authors familiar with the ongoing experiment in Stockton, California, in which some poor people are given a monthly stipend with no questions asked? And how realistic is it to expand this model to more people?
Yes, we're certainly aware of it. I think it's incredibly realistic. You know, what we believe from the book, from, you know, sort of what we said in the book, is that there's a gap. There's a gap in the United States between how much money people make and how much money people need. And there are different ways to address that. It could be done through pay, but it also could be done through things like what's happening in Stockton. Lots of other countries, lots of other industrialized countries do that. And it's very successful, because poverty is a lack of money. And so what people need is enough money to buy the things that they need.
And I would add that there have been such experiments going on in our country back to the Nixon administration. He tasked a young Don Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld with investigating UBI, and they very nearly did it. It's not a socialist pipe dream. Milton Friedman thought it was a great idea.
Here's another one. If there was like one person that you could have sit down and read this book cover to cover, start to finish, like your dream reader, who would it be?
My first thought was my brother. Joanne probably has a better answer.
You know, I guess it's funny. I guess I sort of have two answers to that. One is, who would I like to have read it so that they would tell everybody and then everybody would read it, right? Certainly it'd be great if it were an Oprah book club pick. But honestly, I would love it if I would say Reverend William Barber read the book. That would make me really happy. Colleen, is there anybody except your brother?
A lot of wonderful people have read the book. I would like the editor of Forbes magazine to read it. I would like the economy to be covered not as the stock market, but as the reality for people across this country.
Love that thought. Let's see. How did finishing the book feel? Did it feel, I know sometimes finishing a book gets compared to like a kind of birth. Did it feel like that at all? Like sending it out into the world?
Yeah, it did feel kind of like my husband said I had postpartum depression because I didn't know what to do with myself.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was amazing, but I think that, we worked on this book over a period of 3 years. So it wasn't, it didn't ever feel quite done. Also because, when we had finished it, COVID had just started and we had to then, add some about COVID. So even once it was done, it wasn't really done. Right, Colleen?
Yeah, and it still doesn't feel done. Like we're still talking about it all the time.
Right.
Well, actually, I feel like we work harder on the book now than we did when we were writing it.
Right.
If everyone in this little Zoom room were to take one action tomorrow off the basis of the contents of this book, what would you want it to be?
To call their senator, congressperson, and ask them to extend the fully refundable child tax credit beyond COVID, to make it permanent.
That's a good one. I might second that one, but since I get to add one, I will say while you're on the phone with them, tell them to vote for the PRO Act. They're not going to raise the minimum wage, obviously. Workers need the right to represent themselves, and that's been eroding since the 1980s. The PRO Act will help organized labor, and that will help us all get closer to a living wage.
All right. Well, I for one wrote that down, and I hope our audience members are listening. But we are just about out of time here. Do you want to share what you're working on right now, or project with the the diaper bank? I blanked on the word diaper bank, or perhaps another book in the pipeline.
Certainly at the National Diaper Bank Network, we're very focused on a variety of things, but certainly the End Diaper Need Act, which Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro and Barbara Lee have championed. And that is, the goal of that bill would be to get $200 million a year over a period of 3 to 5 years to help diaper banks across the country. And the other thing I think that's really important, given that this is a Connecticut event, we were really lucky to have Janet introduce us. And I think that if there are people in Connecticut who are interested in getting more involved, certainly they can, contact Janet. I know that there are volunteer opportunities and certainly other opportunities as well. So I hope people will think about that as well.
In addition to supporting Joanne's absolutely essential and amazing basic needs work, I also work in legal system reform And I'm working with a bunch of advocates right now who are going to be releasing a report that shows a disparity in policing, racial profiling that really catches young men and derails their life tremendously. And those issues are inseparable from poverty. They all strengthen each other. So we have to chip away at all of them at once. We have to change everything.
But start small. All right. Well, one step at a time. Thank you so much, Colleen and Joanne, for joining us today. Thank you, Kia, for being here, and Janet for introducing. As a reminder, Broken America is available in store and online from RJ Julia and Wesley and RJ Julia. The links are there for you in the chat box. And I think that's about it. So thank you everyone so much. And we just dropped a link to the Diaper Bank website if you're interested in volunteering, donating, all that. So yeah, buy the book, support the Diaper Bank. That's about it on my end. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much. And thanks to RJ Julia for hosting us.